So of all the fighting games I've covered on my channel so far, Super Turbo is definitely one that needs the least amount of introduction. It's the fifth and definitive version of Street Fighter 2, and to a lot of fighting game lovers, it's the perfect game, which is why it's still played at an insanely high level 30 years after its release in 1994, with no signs of stopping. Play Super Turbo, it's a good game. But I'm not here to talk about this legendary fighting game. I'm here to talk about its weird one-off sequel, and its other unrelated one-off sequel, and its two other unrelated one-off sequels. In an attempt to cash in on the nostalgia and beauty of Super Turbo, Capcom has made 4 different sequels throughout the past 20 years that all build off the foundation of Super Turbo rather than each other, which is just endlessly fascinating to me because I can't think of many examples of this unique situation. So, let's take a look into all of the sequels to Super Turbo. So our first Super Turbo sequel is a wild one, because it didn't hit the arcades or home consoles, but instead, graced fighting game fans on a tiny Game Boy Advance cartridge. Released 7 years after the original in 2001, Super Street Fighter 2 Turbo Revival is really interesting to me, not only because they somehow shoved the gameplay of Super Turbo onto the GBA and made it work, but because of all the aesthetic changes and additional content that was put into such a tiny package. Turbo Revival, as its name implies, was a way to bring Street Fighter 2 back for a new generation, but interestingly, it didn't go the total nostalgia bait route and be a downgraded portable port of the arcade classic. Turbo Revival has totally new art for all the characters by Edeon, which in my opinion has become some of the most iconic art in the series and set the standard for how a lot of these characters would look in the modern era. They even made brand new stages for some of the characters, with Kin's stage being on the streets of San Francisco. Guile gets to fight over the ocean while a plane watches over, and M. Bison's new stage takes place in a dark Shadowloo lair. While Balrog gets an edited version of his Alpha 3 stage, Chun-Li gets her super nauseating Alpha 2 bike stage, and Ryu gets a new nighttime homage to his Third Strike stage. They also brought back the bonus stages that were removed from Super Turbo, and added a bunch of single player content like a decent training mode, a bunch of survival and time attack modes, like one where you had to battle against a gauntlet of 100 different opponents, or a boss rush against all the Shotos, including Akuma and Shin Akuma, who were both added as playable characters too. And I also love the new Extra Gauge mode, where it changes how meter works in the game, allowing you to whiff normals to build meter and even carry over your bar to the next round. But, okay. How does Turbo Revival actually play? Honestly, in my opinion, pretty good. While this isn't going to replace a CPS2 board at any tournaments, it's still an impressive feat how nice this game feels, even if the concessions made to fit Super Turbo onto the Game Boy Advance are pretty obvious. Like the fact that, the Game Boy Advance only has 4 buttons, and Street Fighter is a 6-button game, which is a pretty big strike against this game already. But to remedy this problem, Turbo Revival has the option to let the player assign a button layout to either hold down or press 2 buttons together to get whatever third punch and kick button they'd be missing. While this does make being precise a bit harder, Turbo Revival does also have an easy execution mode that's weirdly available at any time by pressing the select button while in a match, so you can spam Hadokens all day on a half-inch D-pad. When easy execution mode is activated, you can perform any special moves by pressing a direction and a button, like in Smash Bros, and you can do a super by pressing A and B together. Doing supers this way also ignores charge times for characters with charged supers, so you can walk forward even more menacingly with Balrog now. It's really goofy and makes it seem like you have some godlike execution. Continuing with the portable concessions, most of the sprites for the characters in Turbo Revival were taken from the already downscaled 16-bit Super Nintendo port of Super Street Fighter 2, the new Challengers, because they're smaller and have less frames of animation to save on space. But this creates a funny issue besides just being less fluid than the arcade version. A lot of characters got new moves in Super Turbo that they didn't have in new Challengers, so instead of creating brand new sprites to fit in with the Super Nintendo sprites, Capcom just slapped in some arcade sprites alongside the 16-bit sprites for the characters' new moves, leading to some jarring results. The most ridiculous example of this has to come from Akuma though, who first appeared in Super Turbo and doesn't have a downgraded console port sprite, so they just put all of his arcade sprites in, meaning he's the only character with full animation and a real walk cycle. Very goofy indeed. There's also a lot of weird stuff, like the fact that win quotes have been given to the wrong characters, and there's a really infamous glitch where the game just straight up freezes right before the fight with Akuma in arcade mode, which freezes the game. I'm not sure if all of these issues stem from early Game Boy Advance development, a lack of memory, or deadlines and budgets, but I'm going to go on a limb and assume it's all three of these, because Crawfish Interactive showed how crazy you can get with GBA fighting games with their port of Street Fighter Alpha 3 that came a few years later. But even though I just pointed out all of these issues, I still have a huge soft spot for Turbo Revival, and I still think it's a pretty solid addition to the Super Turbo family, especially for the time and platform. Our second Super Turbo sequel is a really cool one, because it was released as the 15th anniversary celebration of the Street Fighter series. Originally released at the very end of 2003 in Japanese arcades and consoles, Hyper Street Fighter 2 combined every main arcade version of Street Fighter 2 into one game that let the players choose which version of a character they preferred. This means you could pick World Warrior version Guile against your friend's Super Turbo version Chun-Li, and both of those characters would have the mechanics, moves, and even sound effects straight from that version of the game. This Street Fighter 2 Dream Match is a lot of fun because the balance between the 5 versions of Street Fighter 2 varied greatly between each release, and every different version has different system mechanics and quirks. Super Turbo characters of course have supers, World Warrior characters can't play mirror matches with themselves, the CPS-1 characters have different chain combos, and so much more. Because there are basically 64 different characters in this game, the matchup spread is pretty crazy and there's tons of depth, but it didn't replace Super Turbo in the tournament scene for a multitude of reasons. First of all, it being released in the mid-2000s meant the arcade version was a small release that wouldn't make much of an impact outside of Japan, where arcade Super Turbo culture was still strong. There's also the fact that its main draw, having a bunch of characters, means it's not the most balanced game in the world. Some Championship Edition characters run amok against a lot of the cast because they can control the game super easily. Some of the characters also weren't 100% accurate to their game-specific version either, and there was some input glitching with charge moves that was later fixed in revisions of the game, but affected the console ports when they first came out on PS2 and Xbox. But it's still a fun as hell game, and it was the first big fighting game that did something I wish more fighting games did, especially in the modern era. With fighting games being updated so often nowadays, many versions of the games we play are essentially lost media, so having a non-competitive version select would not only just be cool, but it would also be archiving a bit of fighting game history as well. So, anyways, Hyper Street Fighter 2 rules. Now we're on to either the most famous or infamous Super Turbo sequel. Of course, I'm talking about Super Street Fighter 2 Turbo HD Remix. For those who aren't in the know, HD Remix started off as a straight HD port of the beloved Super Turbo after Capcom's Xbox Live Arcade release of Hyper Fighting broke records for being the fastest selling game on the new online marketplace, proving the interest for Street Fighter was there. At some point in development though, the lead designer David Sirlin, who was an accomplished competitive Street Fighter player, was given the blessing from Capcom to not only make Super Turbo high definition, but to essentially remake his favorite fighting game ever. With Udon redrawing every frame of animation, members of the Overclocked Remix community composing new remixes of every song, and now David Sirlin with the weight of having to improve on one of the most beloved fighting games ever. I can't understate how crazy of a project this was, as it was essentially like Capcom handing the keys over to the fans. Even though Super Turbo is a classic, it does have design choices that make it a hard game for some to swallow competitively. So David Sirlin's philosophy behind his intent and design for HD Remix is pretty solid, as his 3 main design goals were: make the game easier to play, more inclusive rather than exclusive, make the game even more balanced for tournament play, and add fun as long as it doesn't interfere with number 2. He pushed this philosophy in HD Remix by changing harder inputs to easier ones, nerfing and buffing characters, relaxing some of the more strict system mechanics, and even adding new moves. Although Sirlin was very familiar with Super Turbo, he had a team of other accomplished Super Turbo OGs from the US and Japan all give insights on what balancing decisions and changes should be made, which ended up being over 100 changes from Super Turbo to HD Remix. And while I can't go over all the changes here, David Sirlin's design overview and a complete list of changes is all available on his website. Whether or not you're a fan of the changes made in HD Remix, I think what he's written is an interesting read for anyone interested in this wild project or game design in general. Anyways, in November 2008, HD Remix was finally released onto the Xbox Live Arcade and PlayStation Network, and just like their last digital-only Street Fighter, HD Remix broke new records and became the highest-selling digital game at that point during its first month, bringing in a new era of Super Turbo and Street Fighter for most people, as Street Fighter 4 hadn't been released outside of arcades just yet. But, as I've alluded to before, not everyone was happy. While there were some really nice touches to some characters, some other crazy ideas were implemented that were a bit divisive. Many accused David Sirlin of buffing the characters he played and nerfing characters he hated. Others have come out and said that their suggestions for balance changes were flat out ignored and that David Sirlin wasn't looking out for the community at all. A lot of this is he said she said, but many opponents of HD Remix have voiced their opinions, and even David Sirlin himself has come to the defense of his own project publicly, which he's infamously been known to do a lot. Furthermore, there were others who just didn't like the new art direction, which even David Sirlin wishes he could have changed, as he just wanted redrawn HD Super Turbo sprites instead of HD sprites with the new art direction. But hey, David Sirlin had some foresight, as you're able to play the game with original Super Turbo balancing and sprites if you wanted to, although the original backgrounds weren't included for some reason. There's also a multitude of dip switches included that can change a lot of aspects of the game and how characters work. And hell, the game even included hitboxes in training mode. We're still begging developers to add hitbox display to modern fighting games now. So while HD Remix did have a competitive tournament run, it eventually fell out of popularity, and once it did, never really came back. Weirdly, HD Remix never released officially in Japan, so the main player base that was keeping Super Turbo alive never adopted it. And so, whenever Super Turbo is played today, it's the arcade original of course, and not HD Remix. To say the least, HD Remix is a very divisive game. Some to this day praise and even still play HD Remix, and at this point, there are players whose nostalgia bait fighting game is HD Remix, cause it's what got them into fighting games, and it's as old as Super Turbo was when HD Remix was created. I personally think the game is pretty cool, and I played it a lot back in the day. Although a bit controversial to some, I hope it gets re-released at some point to at least preserve its history, because right now it's stuck in 360 and PS3 limbo, and I think that's super lame. And now we're finally onto the last official Super Turbo sequel, as of right now at least. Ultra Street Fighter 2: The Final Challengers. This game is just super weird. In 2017, for Street Fighter's 30th anniversary, Street Fighter's then series producer, Yoshinori Ono, came up with the wacky idea of releasing a Switch exclusive update to Street Fighter 2, and this is definitely the release that had the most drastic ideas that would change how Street Fighter 2 is played altogether. But before we get into those changes, let's just go over the obvious. So, Ultra threw out all of the balance changes from HD Remix, and changed up the Super Turbo balance once again. Sorry Sirlin. But still lets the player choose between having the HD Remix look or the original arcade sprites for the game. The main draw of Ultra Street Fighter 2 was the addition of Evil Ryu and Violent Ken as characters, and honestly this rules. They're stupidly busted characters just like Akuma, but just the simple fact that we got brand new Street Fighter 2 characters blows my mind and makes me super happy. Especially since this is the first official Capcom game appearance of Violent Ken, who had only appeared in the Street Fighter 2 animated movie and SNK vs Capcom Chaos before. Evil Ryu is definitely the more tame character of the two. He has teleports, a true red fireball, Raging Demon, and a hop kick, which I totally love. But Violent Ken is just super nuts and has an insane Shoryuken game, and more importantly, a command dash that can cross up. Street Fighter 2 characters are not supposed to move like this. It's so dumb, I love it. These characters had super low health and stun to balance them, but it didn't matter because if they touched you, you were probably dead. For some insane reason, Capcom didn't ban these dudes from ranked, so if you've ever jumped online, you better get used to the Sasei no Hado. But okay, let's get back to the system mechanics changes. So first of all, they added true throw techs. In Street Fighter 2, throws are super strong, and you couldn't do anything about being thrown until Super Turbo, which allowed you to soften throws, but you'd still take damage. But Ultra just straight up gives the game a real throw tech, and as a filthy boxer main, this hurts me. Also, the game's input buffer system is off because avid Super Turbo players can't seem to get their links into Super that they usually hit consistently. So, all of these changes definitely make for a very different Super Turbo experience. And that doesn't necessarily make Ultra Street Fighter 2 bad, it's just a different game. And like every other game we've covered today, if you go in expecting pristine Super Turbo, you won't be happy. Ultra Street Fighter 2 does include more than just versus and arcade mode though, as it has a color edit mode where you can make some crazy abominations, or just make Evil Ryu look like regular Ryu. And it also has a dramatic battle mode where you and a friend can play against computers at the same time, which is always a nice touch for some casual fun. There's also a weird first person minigame where you chunk out Hadokens with the Joy-Cons, but we don't talk about that. Overall, Ultra Street Fighter 2 is a super strange game that exists for some reason. I don't know why it does, but I appreciate that it's here. I think it's a lot of casual fun, and I would be super interested in seeing some of the Super Turbo legends playing it at a high level, without the evil Shotos of course, because this is probably the most unexplored Street Fighter game. Looking up tech and just resources for this game in general is impossible right now. And that has to do with the fact that it's stuck in platform limbo and needs to be ported to PC and modern consoles as soon as possible, just like HD Remix. Earlier I said Ultra Street Fighter 2 was the last official Super Turbo sequel, because there's one more game I'd like to talk about, and that's the fan-made update to Super Turbo called Super Street Fighter 2 Turbo New Legacy. New Legacy is a ROM hack of the original arcade version that is a one-man passion project of the Brazilian Super Turbo player Born to SPD that aims to rebalance the cast and add tons of quality of life improvements to Super Turbo, from bug fixes to color and stage selects to even sprite fixes. Born to SPD says that the goal of New Legacy isn't to replace Super Turbo, but to be a tribute game for Super Turbo players looking for something a bit different. Being a ROM hack, New Legacy is playable on real arcade hardware and online on Fightgate 2, where it's garnered its own player base and scene. New Legacy is an amazing project that is so impressive to me, so if you want to try it out for yourself, check out the New Legacy website. We salute your dedication, Born to SPD. And that's all the Super Turbo sequels. Funnily enough, we have enough Super Turbo sequels to make a Super Turbo sequel collection, so have at it Capcom, it's a free idea. No matter if you're eating vanilla Super Turbo ice cream, or enjoying other Super Turbo sequel flavors, at the end of the day, we can all come together to appreciate this fighting game masterpiece, and hope it's being played and being re-released until the heat death of the universe. Thanks!